when a young boy darted into the hallway, frantically calling out for his teacher and begging for help to escape a home he described as a nightmare. Mr. Simmons at first wondered if it might be a misunderstanding, perhaps stress or exaggeration. But the moment he noticed the bruises on the boy's forearm, he felt a jolt of alarm that could not be dismissed. The child's words came out in a tumble of terror. "Please, you have to get me away." Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of courage, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Mr. Simmons led the trembling boy into the nearest empty classroom, closing the door behind them. He lowered himself to the child's eye level, heart pounding with an urgency he hadn't felt since his first year of teaching. The boy was Charlie, a shy foster child who had only joined Sycamore Middle School at the start of the spring semester. His face shone with tears, and he clung to his backpack as though it were a life vest in stormy seas. Charlie stammered again, repeating his plea. "They hurt me. I can't stay there anymore." In those early days at Sycamore Middle School, Charlie had been so quiet that most people barely noticed him. He was skinny, with soft brown hair that often looked as though it needed a trim, and downcast eyes that refused to meet anyone else's for more than a second. His arrival had been unremarkable to most of the staff, but Mr. Simmons took note of the tension in the boy's posture. It was the way his shoulders slumped, or how his gaze darted around the room like he was bracing for a threat. Still, for the first couple of weeks, Mr. Simmons chalked it up to typical nerves of a new student in an unfamiliar environment. But soon, small warning signs surfaced. Charlie had a bruise on his forearm that he tried to keep hidden under the sleeve of his sweater. When asked about it, he mumbled something about falling off his bike. There was a band of purple around his wrist that didn't quite match the story, yet Mr. Simmons didn't press the issue too much at the time. Still, an uneasy feeling clung to him. He had seen enough kids in rough situations during his own youth to recognize the subtle signs of deeper trouble. Now, the reality hit him in the face with the force of a hammer blow. Charlie was asking for immediate help, not simply confiding in a teacher. Through choking sobs, Charlie insisted that going back to Martin and Rebecca Reynolds, the foster parents everyone praised as community pillars, would be a death knell for his spirit. He shook from head to toe, the bright fluorescent lights of the classroom revealing the slight hollowness under his cheeks and new bruises peeking out along the collar of his shirt. Mr. Simmons felt a surge of protectiveness, tempered by the gravity of the situation. Charlie's words came in fits and starts. He talked about punishments, about being grabbed or shoved, about unspoken threats that lurked around every corner at home. He described a locked closet in the basement that he feared might soon be used for more than just intimidation. Mr. Simmons listened, each revelation firing his concern to new heights. He knew he had to do something, anything, but also that the system required careful steps. It wouldn't be enough to whisk Charlie away. There had to be protocols, calls to social services, official checks. The knowledge that each hour might put Charlie in more danger spurred him into urgent action. He stood from his crouch and placed a gentle hand on Charlie's back, leading him to the counselor's office. Mrs. Anderson, the school counselor, had suspected something was off about Charlie for a while. She specialized in spotting the hidden signals of abuse or severe emotional distress. Her primary role was to keep an eye on new transfer students and ensure they were settling in well. When she saw Charlie trembling, red-eyed, and clinging to Mr. Simmons's arm, her face softened with empathy yet filled with steely resolve. She directed Charlie to sit on a padded chair, offering tissues and water before quietly urging him to share what he had just told Mr. Simmons. Charlie took a shaky breath and repeated his story, haltingly describing the cycle of fear that began shortly after he moved in with the Reynolds. He talked about being denied meals if he made any misstep, about the times Martin would grip him so hard that bruises formed under his fingers. Rebecca's chilling threats about what would happen if he ever spoke to anyone outside the home hung in the air. Through it all, Mrs. Anderson nodded gently, giving Charlie space to pause when tears overtook him. Mr. Simmons hovered in the background, fists clenching at the horror of it all. Part of what made this situation so alarming was the public image of Martin and Rebecca Reynolds. They were, by all accounts, model citizens, People who volunteered at every neighborhood drive, donated to charity events, and were known for their hospitable open house gatherings. Their meticulously curated appearance of generosity and kindness made it all the more difficult to believe they could be abusive. It also meant that any complaint against them might be met with skepticism by people unfamiliar with the complexities of child welfare. But Charlie's sobbing, the bruises, and Mr. Simmons's gut feeling pointed to a reality that contradicted their shining reputation. Mrs. Anderson gently pressed Charlie for more details, ensuring every piece of information was documented. She noted the times he claimed Martin locked him in his room, the chores he was forced to do late at night, and the silence he was expected to maintain under threat of physical harm. The counselor knew they would need as much specific detail as possible to involve Child Protective Services effectively. When Charlie finally finished speaking, he looked drained, and Mrs. Anderson quietly asked Mr. Simmons to wait in the hall while she made some calls. Mr. Simmons paced outside her office, heart pounding. His own memories of being in the foster system as a boy rose to the surface. He recalled the terror of not being believed when he voiced suspicions about one of his own foster placements long ago. The bruises that were explained away as a clumsy kid, the well-meaning but overworked social workers who sometimes missed glaring red flags. He remembered also the relief he felt when, finally, one caring adult took notice and intervened. Now it was his turn to be that caring adult for Charlie. He pulled out his phone and debated calling the principal, Dr. Roberts, but decided Mrs. Anderson had likely already alerted her. Instead, he took a moment to text the nurse, Ms. Walton, to be on standby in case Charlie needed a medical check or just a place to rest quietly. The minutes passed like hours until Mrs. Anderson opened her office door and gestured him back inside. Charlie sat in the same chair, fidgeting with a tissue in his hand. His eyes were still wet, but there was a spark of hope in them now. Mrs. Anderson informed both of them that she had reached Mr. Carter, a social worker with Child Protective Services, who would come immediately to the school. She had explained the urgency. Mr. Simmons noticed the tension in Charlie's shoulders eased just a fraction at this news. He knelt beside the boy and whispered, "You're doing the right thing. I promise we'll keep you safe." Charlie nodded, though anxiety still rippled across his features. Even a faint glimmer of trust at that moment was a monumental step forward for a child accustomed to silence and fear. Soon Dr. Roberts, the principal, arrived. She was a stern yet fair woman with a no-nonsense manner, especially where students' welfare was concerned. She listened to Mrs. Anderson's briefing in a low voice, occasionally glancing at Charlie with concern. In her quiet but firm tone she said, "We'll protect him. We'll do everything by the book, so the Reynolds can't slip out of this." Though short on words, her resolve was unwavering, and it brought a sense of gravity that the situation deserved. If the principal was fully on board, the school would move mountains to ensure Charlie's immediate safety. Mr. Carter arrived not long after. He was an older man with graying hair at his temples and a measured calm in his demeanor. He greeted Charlie softly, introduced himself, and explained he was there to help. Charlie shifted in his chair, still uncertain if he could trust another adult in a system that seemed stacked against kids like him. Slowly, he answered Mr. Carter's questions, repeating the details about life with Martin and Rebecca, albeit with a trembling voice. Mr. Carter scribbled notes methodically, occasionally glancing up to gauge Charlie's expressions. Then, Mr. Carter asked a question that made the boy flinch. "Do you have any evidence of what's been happening? Photos, a diary, something that can't be explained away too easily?" Charlie hesitated, then mentioned his sketchbook. Mr. Simmons froze, remembering the pages he had glimpsed once when Charlie dropped the book in class, haunting images of shadows, tears, and words scrawled like a desperate cry for help. Charlie admitted he often drew pictures of what went on at home, coded in images that he felt safer drawing than speaking out loud. Mr. Carter insisted on seeing it, and Charlie nodded. It was in his backpack. With shaky hands, Charlie pulled out the worn notebook, its edges frayed from handling. He opened to a page that showed a silhouette of a large figure looming over a smaller one, a belt dangling from one hand. Next to it, words were written in halting letters. "Don't tell. Another page depicted a small boy in the corner of a dark, locked space. A third had bruises colored in purple and blue around cartoonish arms, labeled "Me." Mr. Carter's face grew grim as he flipped through, occasionally glancing at Mr. Simmons and Mrs. Anderson. The drawings, though childlike, were powerful enough to convey real terror. Outside the counselor's office, the school day continued. Classes changed. Students chattered in the halls, unaware of the quiet storm brewing in that small room. Inside, Charlie's fate was being decided. Mr. Carter's next call was to the police liaison officer assigned to Sycamore Middle, requesting a protective presence on campus, just in case. He explained that there was a credible claim of abuse, and the child should not be allowed to leave with his foster parents under any circumstances until everything was sorted. Once the officer arrived, Dr. Roberts and Mrs. Anderson guided Charlie to a calmer space, the nurse's office, which had a small cot and a more soothing atmosphere. Mr. Simmons stayed by the door, wanting to give Charlie a bit of space while also remaining available should the boy want his teacher's presence. From the hallway, Mr. Simmons caught a glimpse of Mrs. Anderson speaking quietly with Mr. Carter about next steps, a possible emergency protective order, official interviews, and the immediate need to keep Charlie away from Martin and Rebecca. Mrs. Anderson stepped out to let them know that Martin and Rebecca would be called to the school. The plan was that once they arrived, the social worker and the police liaison officer would meet them. Charlie's custody would be decided by Child Protective Services pending an investigation. The tension in Mr. Simmons's chest grew. He had no idea how the Reynolds would react. He had heard only rumors about their placid public demeanor, but if Charlie's allegations were true, they might not be so calm behind closed doors. Sure enough, about an hour later, the secretary placed a call to Dr. Roberts's office. Martin Reynolds was here, demanding to see his foster son. Dr. Roberts and Mr. Carter went to greet him, leaving Charlie in the nurse's office under the officer's supervision. Mr. Simmons, feeling compelled to stand guard, lingered in the hallway. He caught sight of Martin as he strode in, a tall man, well-built, with the sort of upright posture that exuded confidence, even arrogance. He wore a polite smile, but his eyes flashed with impatience. Mr. Simmons sensed danger there, an undercurrent of anger that lurked just beneath the surface. Martin was told that Charlie would not be released to him until after a conversation with the social worker and possibly law enforcement. He pretended to be cooperative, though Mr. Simmons could see his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle of his briefcase. Rebecca Reynolds also appeared, stepping in with a mild expression that seemed carefully rehearsed. Her clothing was neat, her makeup expertly applied, and she wore the frazzled but caring expression of someone trying to look like a concerned parent. The moment Mr. Carter confronted them about the allegations, Martin's face contorted in barely suppressed rage. He insisted it was all a misunderstanding, that Charlie was a troubled child who liked to fabricate stories for attention. Rebecca added, "He's always drawing these morbid pictures. We tried to get him help, but he refused. We've never laid a finger on him. I don't know what he's told you, but you have to understand, he needs psychological support, not another move to a new home." Mr. Simmons seethed at how smoothly they twisted the narrative. He could only watch as they tried to manipulate Mr. Carter. But Mr. Carter had the advantage of Charlie's sketches, bruises that had been inspected by the nurse, and an official statement from the boy. Still, the social worker's calm, methodical approach irritated Martin, who demanded to see Charlie immediately. Dr. Roberts, standing firm, refused. "We're not letting you near him right now," she said, voice unyielding. "As principal, I'm responsible for his well-being in this building, and I won't allow him to be put in a potentially harmful situation." Martin's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, aware that being outwardly aggressive here would only strengthen the case against him. He glared at Mr. Simmons, as though suspecting him of orchestrating this entire scenario. Mr. Simmons held the glare, refusing to back down. In that moment, he vowed that no matter what it took, he would not allow Charlie to return to that toxic environment. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Anderson joined them, quietly urging all parties to remain calm. She explained that CPS would make the final call, and for the moment, They were awaiting further instructions from law enforcement. Martin clenched his fists and snapped. "We have rights. This is our foster son. We'll be taking him home tonight. You have no authority to keep him here." Mr. Carter's measured response deflated some of Martin's bluster. "We have authority when a credible accusation of abuse is made, sir. I'm afraid you'll have to leave the premises or wait in another room while we finalize our assessment." Rebecca looked as if she wanted to shout but held herself back. With a curt nod, Martin allowed the police officer to escort them to a vacant conference room, where they were told to remain until the matter was resolved. As soon as they were out of earshot, Mr. Simmons exhaled shakily. He glanced at Mrs. Anderson. "They're not going to give up easily, are they?" he asked in a half-whisper. She shook her head. "No, I don't think so. But we have enough cause to keep Charlie safe right now. That's all that matters." Meanwhile, the child in question was curled up on the nurse's office cot, hugging his backpack. The nurse, Ms. Walton, had offered him a hot pack to place on his stomach, noticing he seemed pale and nauseous. Fear had robbed him of his appetite, and tears kept leaking from the corners of his eyes. His mind whirled with images of Martin's fury. He pictured the basement closet, the sharp ring of a belt snapping against the air. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to push these thoughts away. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him flinch involuntarily. Would they drag him back? But it was Mr. Simmons who stepped inside, approaching carefully, as though not to startle him. "Hey, buddy," Mr. Simmons said, his voice soft. "You're safe here. No one's going to let them near you until we figure this out." Charlie turned his face toward him, eyes red and full of questions. "What if they try anyway?" Charlie whispered. Mr. Simmons shook his head. "They won't. We have an officer, and Mr. Carter is on your side." "We all are." Charlie nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Still, it was something. Throughout the school day, teachers and students noticed that unusual tension had settled over the administration offices, but few knew the details. Rumors circulated. Someone said the police were there because a kid had stolen something. Another claimed there was a threat made against a teacher. Only Olivia, Charlie's compassionate classmate, seemed to sense something more serious. She had often tried to reach out to Charlie in the cafeteria or during group projects, noticing the bruises that he tried to hide. She saw the haunted look in his eyes and guessed it was more than just a bad home situation. During lunch, she tiptoed to the nurse's office to see if he was there. Finding the door guarded by the school officer, Olivia hesitated. She peeked in once the officer stepped aside for a moment, spotting Charlie lying down. He looked up and recognized her. A fleeting attempt at a smile crossed his face, quickly replaced by tears. Olivia whispered, "I'm sorry, Charlie. I wish I could have done more sooner." She trailed off, feeling powerless. Charlie gave a slight shrug, tears slipping onto the pillow. Though she couldn't come closer, her presence felt oddly comforting. She left him with a small bag of cookies she had brought for lunch, hoping it would be some solace. At the end of the school day, Dr. Roberts and Mr. Carter reconvened. They informed Martin and Rebecca that Charlie would be placed under temporary protective custody immediately, meaning he wouldn't be returning home with them. The rage that flared in Martin's eyes was terrifying. He nearly threw a chair in the conference room but was stopped by the officer's stern warning. Rebecca, tears in her eyes, insisted they were being wrongly accused, that the school was meddling in their private affairs. But the process was already in motion. As far as CPS was concerned, the risk to Charlie was too great to ignore. Charlie left the building with Mr. Carter, who took him to a safer location for the evening, a short-term foster arrangement with a family known for emergency placements. Mr. Simmons, who had never felt so emotionally invested in a student's personal life, watched them go from the front steps of the school. He felt a swirl of relief and dread. Relief that Charlie was out of Martin and Rebecca's direct reach, and dread because he knew how complicated these legal battles could become. A child could easily be returned to the very abusers from whom he'd just been rescued, depending on the outcome of the investigation and what evidence was deemed admissible. Over the coming days, the local police began a formal inquiry. They wanted to search the Reynolds home, interview neighbors, review medical reports, and speak to Charlie again once he was in a calmer state. Mr. Simmons and Mrs. Anderson gave official statements recounting everything Charlie had told them. They mentioned the sketches, the bruises, and the fear in his eyes. Dr. Roberts backed them up, citing the professional obligation to report suspected abuse. The more they pressed forward, the more enraged Martin and Rebecca became, lawyered up, and tried to stoke local sympathy by portraying themselves as victims of a smear campaign. In a small community that had admired the Reynolds for their charitable deeds, confusion spread. Some people believed them, refusing to accept that such upright citizens could be cruel. Others, especially those who recalled subtle oddities at the Reynolds' past barbecues, began to suspect that behind their polished façade lay something dark. Charlie, however, remained the central piece of the puzzle. His testimony, combined with any tangible evidence found in the house, would determine whether the Reynolds would face charges. Charlie's new emergency foster home was with a woman named Mrs. Foster, ironically matched to her role as a caregiver. She was kind, with a no-nonsense approach, and made sure Charlie had hot meals and a quiet room. But Charlie struggled to sleep. Nightmares hounded him. He would wake up sweaty, heart racing, convinced that Martin was about to grab him. Still, each time, Mrs. Foster would come into his room, turn on the nightlight, and reassure him that he was safe. She also allowed him to keep his sketchbook close, though she gently advised him to avoid drawing late into the night if it triggered more bad memories. At school, Mr. Simmons discreetly checked on Charlie's well-being each day. The tension around the Reynolds case had not died down. In fact, the more it spread, the more the faculty found themselves under scrutiny from the community. Some parents worried, asking if it was possible the school had overreacted. Others demanded that more strict measures be taken to protect children. Dr. Roberts held a staff meeting and reminded everyone of their duty as mandated reporters, encouraging them to stand firm despite any backlash. Charlie tried to keep a low profile, but he couldn't ignore the whispers in the hall. Classmates asked him if he was lying about the bruises, or if he was just trying to get attention. Some believed him outright, offering him kind words. Olivia was at the forefront of those who supported him, often guiding him through the cafeteria line and inviting him to sit with her group of friends. He rarely spoke, but he found solace in her presence. Sometimes she would slip him a snack or a small note with a silly doodle. Those little acts of kindness reminded him that not everyone in the world was out to hurt him. Meanwhile, the police search of the Reynolds home turned up disturbing signs. Though the house was mostly immaculate, they found a small, locked closet in the basement that matched Charlie's description. Scuff marks on the inside suggested it had been used to confine someone. Hidden behind a tool shelf, an old belt with suspicious stains was discovered, though it wasn't clear if it was related to any of Charlie's injuries. Additionally, neighbors reported hearing heated arguments late at night and seeing Charlie forced to do yard work at odd hours, but none had wanted to speak up. The tide was shifting against Martin and Rebecca. Still, the Reynolds were not giving up. Through their lawyer, they claimed that Charlie was troubled, that he had a history of mental instability, and that they were trying to get him help. They pointed to the violent sketches as evidence of Charlie's disturbed mind. Mr. Carter, on the other hand, produced medical records that noted older bruises on Charlie's body, each consistent with physical aggression rather than accidents. The case moved toward a court hearing, where a judge would decide if Charlie should remain under protective custody or be returned to the Reynolds pending a more extensive trial. Charlie's anxiety skyrocketed in the lead up to the hearing. He understood, at least in the limited way a child can, that everything about his immediate future hinged on whether the judge believed him. He had therapy sessions with a counselor recommended by Mrs. Anderson, a gentlewoman named Dr. Stein, who tried to prepare him for the possibility that he might have to testify in some form. The idea of being in the same courtroom as Martin and Rebecca made Charlie's stomach churn. Yet Dr. Stein explained that sometimes, child victims could provide recorded video testimony or speak through a separate chamber to avoid direct confrontation. Mr. Simmons, feeling more protective than ever, offered to be there for Charlie every step of the way. One afternoon, as Charlie sat alone in the art room, Mr. Simmons came by to see how he was doing. Charlie was working on a painting, a swirling mass of dark blues and blacks with a single small figure in the corner, painted in pale yellow. Mr. Simmons gently asked, "Is that supposed to be you?" Charlie nodded, dabbing at the figure with careful strokes. "Yeah, I guess it's me, surrounded by darkness." Mr. Simmons placed a hand on his shoulder. "Darkness can't last forever. You've got people on your side now." It was during one of these quieter moments that Charlie mentioned someone named Logan. He did so abruptly, while Mr. Simmons was cleaning up paintbrushes. "Logan was my older foster brother," Charlie said, voice quivering. "He was placed with the Reynolds before me. I didn't know about him at first. I found one of his old things in the closet, an old scribbled note." Mr. Simmons paused, water running into the sink. "What happened to him?" he asked gently. Charlie explained that he believed Logan had been taken away for reasons unknown, but he feared Logan might have run away or experienced something even worse. The Reynolds never spoke about him, and Charlie only learned the name from a scrawled piece of paper left behind in a dresser drawer. "Logan's stuff, hands off." The mention of Logan clarified for Mr. Simmons just how deep this pattern might run. It wasn't simply Charlie's isolated experience. There could be others who had been harmed or frightened into silence. He quietly shared this information with Mrs. Anderson, who passed it along to Mr. Carter, prompting them to investigate if there had been prior complaints or other foster children. The legal complexities grew. Every new piece of evidence painted the Reynolds in a darker light, but building a foolproof case was a slow, painstaking process. At last, the day of the preliminary court hearing arrived. Charlie, dressed in a plain collared shirt, was accompanied by Mr. Carter and a guardian ad litem, a court-appointed advocate who represented Charlie's interests. He looked pale and shaky, clutching a small plush toy that Mrs. Foster had given him for courage. Martin and Rebecca sat across the courtroom, wearing concerned expressions that Mr. Simmons, observing from behind, suspected were carefully rehearsed. Their lawyer wasted no time, trying to frame Charlie as an unstable teen with a penchant for lying. The tension ratcheted up when the judge examined the evidence: photos of Charlie's bruises, the locked closet, the sketches from his notebook, and statements from Mr. Simmons, Mrs. Anderson, and other staff members. The Reynolds lawyer objected repeatedly, trying to strike out the sketches as artistic expression that proved nothing about actual abuse. The judge, however, was unimpressed by those objections. With each new piece of testimony, Martin's polite façade cracked. He glared daggers at Mr. Simmons and Mrs. Anderson, as if personally blaming them for the predicament. Charlie did not have to speak in open court that day, but his recorded statement was played. He had given it in a private session with Dr. Stein and Mr. Carter present, clearly describing times he had been grabbed, shoved, and denied food. At one point, listening to the audio, Charlie put his hands over his ears, unable to hear himself recount the trauma. Mr. Simmons reached out to comfort him, but the court officer signaled them to remain still. This was an official proceeding, so outward displays were limited. Yet the empathy in Mr. Simmons's eyes was unwavering. When it was over, the judge ruled that due to the credible evidence of abuse, Charlie would remain in protective custody while criminal charges were evaluated against the Reynolds. Martin's face went crimson, and he stormed out of the courtroom. Rebecca trailed behind him, expression contorted by fury and disbelief. Outside, a throng of local reporters snapped photos, drawn by the sensational case of model foster parents accused of severe abuse. Charlie shied away from the cameras, burying his face in Mr. Carter's jacket. Mr. Simmons, feeling a fierce protective instinct, shielded Charlie with his own body as they made their way to the car. Life didn't magically become peaceful for Charlie after the hearing. He stayed with Mrs. Foster, but the knowledge that a trial or further proceedings might be on the horizon weighed on him. Anxiety attacks were frequent. Dr. Stein introduced him to grounding techniques, breathing exercises, focusing on small details in his environment, reminding himself that Martin was not standing behind him ready to lash out. At school, Mr. Simmons continued to keep a close watch. A newly installed internal alert system ensured that if Martin or Rebecca tried to appear on campus, the front office would be notified immediately, and security would be called. Olivia, for her part, tried to brighten Charlie's days. She invited him to join her in small group projects in English class, cheerfully offering to share her notes when he felt overwhelmed. During lunch, she'd wait for him outside the cafeteria to walk in together, a subtle gesture that helped him cope with the stares and whispers. She even introduced him to a friend named Marcus, who was into digital art. Marcus showed Charlie how to create digital sketches on a school tablet, opening up new worlds for him to express himself. These small, positive interactions began to outnumber the dark memories, if only by a little. One evening, Charlie opened his old sketchbook, looking for the page that mentioned Logan's name. He traced his fingers over the faint pencil marks, eyes clouded with sorrow. That older brother figure he never actually met might have gone through the same horrors. Did Logan find a safe harbor in some other foster home, or had something worse happened? The question haunted Charlie. He spoke about it to Mr. Carter, who promised he would investigate the Reynolds past placements thoroughly. So far, no one had found conclusive records about Logan's time in that home. As the weeks turned into months, the community's reaction to the scandal took on a new shape. Parents who once praised the Reynolds turned their backs on them, especially after reading more about the shocking allegations. Some neighbors privately admitted they had seen or heard things but were too scared or too unsure to come forward. The district attorney's office decided to proceed with child abuse charges. In turn, Martin and Rebecca's lawyer pushed back, claiming it was all hearsay, that the locked closet was used only for storage, and that bruises could have come from sports. Yet each day, the case against them seemed to grow stronger. In this shifting landscape, Mr. Simmons found himself wrestling with a profound dilemma. He had grown deeply attached to Charlie, wanting to protect him not just as a teacher but as a caring adult who understood the turmoil of foster life. He thought about applying to become a foster parent for Charlie. It was a monumental decision. He was single, lived in a modest home, and devoted much of his energy to teaching. He also knew there would be background checks, home inspections, and the potential for heartbreak if the system decided to send Charlie elsewhere. But the thought of Charlie ending up back in a cycle of uncertainty filled him with dread. He confided in Mrs. Anderson one afternoon, telling her, "I can't just watch him get shuffled around. He needs stability. He's been through too much." Mrs. Anderson nodded. "I think you'd be a wonderful guardian. But are you ready for the responsibility? It can be a long, complicated process." Mr. Simmons took a breath. "I've never been more sure of anything. I was in the system myself. If someone hadn't stepped up for me, I don't know where I'd be right now." Mrs. Anderson placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Then go for it. I'll support you any way I can." He began the preliminary paperwork, contacting the relevant offices. Meanwhile, Charlie remained in Mrs. Foster's care, though Mr. Simmons visited often, taking Charlie to weekend outings, a local museum, a park, or even just an ice cream shop. Each outing was a step in reintroducing Charlie to a world that wasn't hostile at every turn. Slowly, Charlie's sense of trust in Mr. Simmons deepened. They talked about mundane things, favorite movies, the best pizza toppings, the subpar track team at Sycamore Middle. They also had moments of raw honesty. Charlie would talk about the nightmares, about a new bruise he remembered from months ago. Mr. Simmons listened, never downplaying the pain. During one of these trips, a surprising lead emerged. They ran into an older teenager who was rummaging through a used bookstore. He had a faint resemblance to Charlie, the same dark hair, the same uncertain posture. He noticed Charlie, did a double take, and asked, "Hey, did you used to stay with the Reynolds?" Charlie's eyes went wide. "Yes, who are you?" The teen blinked, trembling. "I'm Logan," he said hesitantly. "I was in that home, but I ran away. I couldn't take it anymore." Mr. Simmons felt goosebumps along his arms. This was the Logan Charlie had been worrying about for weeks, if not months. Logan shared a story as harrowing as Charlie's. He had been taken in by the Reynolds 2 years prior. When he reported the abuse, Martin and Rebecca claimed he was a pathological liar. Eventually, Logan got fed up, ran away, and ended up in a different foster care arrangement in another county. He confessed he'd been too scared to speak out publicly, afraid that no one would believe him over the perfect foster parents. Mr. Simmons gently asked if Logan would be willing to provide a statement to the authorities about his experiences. Logan swallowed hard, his face paling at the thought. But seeing Charlie, a younger version of himself, gave him resolve. "They can't keep doing this," Logan muttered. "I'll talk." Mr. Simmons immediately contacted Mr. Carter, who recognized how crucial Logan's testimony could be in solidifying the case. Within days, Logan met with the district attorney's office. His story corroborated many details that Charlie had shared. The locked closet, the belt, the manipulative threats, everything lined up. It was the strongest piece of supporting evidence yet, proving a pattern rather than an isolated incident. The Reynolds lawyer tried to claim Logan was a runaway with a vendetta, but combined with the physical evidence and Charlie's testimony, the claims rang hollow. The momentum building against Martin and Rebecca was undeniable. After a series of pretrial motions, the court set a date for the official criminal trial, though it might take months to conclude. In the meantime, Charlie remained under CPS custody, still living with Mrs. Foster, but longing for some sense of permanence. He was aware that Mr. Simmons had applied to become his foster parent, but he tried to keep his hopes in check. It felt too good to be true, the idea of living with a teacher who actually cared about him, who understood him in ways no one else did. Yet every time he saw Mr. Simmons, that hope grew a little stronger. As the weeks passed, a crucial hearing approached. This hearing would determine if the Reynolds foster license should be permanently revoked, and if Charlie could be placed in a stable long-term arrangement, ideally Mr. Simmons's home. Charlie's anxiety soared to new heights. He had nightmares of the judge looking at him, and then handing him back to Martin. He feared that the Reynolds lawyer might spin more lies. But he also had new confidence, courtesy of Logan's testimony and the unwavering support of Mr. Simmons, Mrs. Anderson, and even Olivia, who believed in him wholeheartedly. One day, after school, Olivia found Charlie in the art room again. He was working on a piece that looked more hopeful than his earlier works. This time, the palette included warm oranges and yellows. She asked, "What's that one about?" He hesitated. "It's about finding a home," he said softly, brushing streaks of gold into the corners. Olivia smiled. "I like it. It feels brighter." Charlie nodded. "It is." She gave him a playful nudge. "You seem a little brighter, too. I mean, compared to when I first met you." Charlie looked at her, eyes misty with gratitude. "Thanks for noticing." The hearing day arrived. The tension in the courthouse corridors was almost tangible. Charlie, dressed in a new set of clothes Mrs. Foster had given him, sat next to Mr. Carter and the guardian ad litem. Mr. Simmons was present as well, quietly offering emotional support. The Reynolds were in attendance with their lawyer, both of them looking worn down but still defiant. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Experts took the stand, including Dr. Stein, who testified about the psychological trauma Charlie exhibited, consistent with abuse. The investigating officers described the locked closet and the belt. Logan delivered his testimony via a live feed, not wanting to be in the same room as the Reynolds. He recounted his experience with composure, though tears streamed down his face by the end. Martin's lawyer tried to pick his story apart, but Logan refused to be bullied. The court also heard statements from neighbors who had come forward, confirming suspicious behavior. When Mr. Simmons was called up, he detailed how he first noticed the bruises, Charlie's withdrawn demeanor, and finally the frantic confession that led them to alert CPS. He acknowledged that he had a personal connection, having once been a foster child himself. The defense tried to argue that Mr. Simmons's personal background made him biased, but he responded calmly, stating that it only made him more vigilant in identifying red flags. The judge seemed sympathetic. Finally, the judge delivered a ruling. Martin and Rebecca's foster license was suspended indefinitely, pending the outcome of the criminal trial. Charlie would remain in protective custody, and the final step was determining whether Mr. Simmons's request to foster Charlie would be approved. A wave of relief washed over Charlie, and he sagged in his seat, tears pooling in his eyes. The Reynolds fumed, but there was little they could do. Over the next month, social services conducted the required home evaluations for Mr. Simmons. They checked his background, interviewed neighbors, and inspected his living space. He had a modest 2-bedroom house in a quiet area near the school. One room was set up as a guest room that he planned to convert into Charlie's bedroom. He made sure everything was in order, from child safety locks in the kitchen to an ample supply of food and comfortable bedding. A CPS representative spent hours talking to him about the responsibilities of foster parenting. They asked about his support system, how he would balance teaching with guardianship, whether he had any counseling resources lined up for Charlie. Mr. Simmons answered each question earnestly. Charlie, for his part, tried not to get too excited. He feared something would go wrong at the last minute. But day by day, the signs looked positive. Finally, he got the news: the placement was approved. The next day, Mr. Simmons arrived at Mrs. Foster's home, smiling so brightly that Charlie momentarily forgot how to breathe. "Ready, buddy?" Mr. Simmons asked, voice trembling just a bit. Charlie nodded, hugging Mrs. Foster goodbye, grateful for her kindness during a traumatic period. Then he climbed into Mr. Simmons's car, heart thrumming with an odd mix of hope and fear. Their first night as a household was quiet. Charlie set down his backpack in his new room, taking in the pale blue walls that Mr. Simmons had freshly painted. A small desk nestled by the window, and there was a soft rug that felt good under his feet. On the bed, a new comforter displayed a pattern of stars, something that made him think of possibilities rather than limitations. He found a note on the desk. "Welcome home, Charlie. Here's to brighter days ahead." It was signed, Mr. S. At dinner, Mr. Simmons cooked spaghetti, and though it wasn't exactly a gourmet meal, Charlie devoured it, as it tasted far better than the meager or withheld meals he sometimes got at the Reynolds. Mr. Simmons explained a few house rules: bedtime on school nights, chores on weekends, honest communication, and mutual respect. "If you ever feel unsafe, or just need to talk, I want you to come to me right away," Mr. Simmons said firmly. Charlie swallowed hard, nodding. It felt surreal, being in a home where the adult wanted him to feel safe and was actually concerned about his well-being. In the days that followed, the arrangement settled into a routine that felt unbelievably normal. They'd wake up, eat a quick breakfast, and drive to school together. After classes, sometimes Charlie stayed for the art club, or Mr. Simmons took him to pick up groceries. On weekends they tackled small projects around the house, like repainting the fence or planting a few new flowers out front. Every now and then, Charlie would flash back to the terror of living with the Reynolds, but Mr. Simmons's steady presence pulled him back to the present. Therapy sessions with Dr. Stein continued. She encouraged Charlie to find healthy outlets for his emotions. Charlie admitted that drawing helped, and he also found himself writing short journal entries about his day. Occasionally, he wrote letters to Logan, though he wasn't sure if Logan's address was stable enough to receive mail. He hoped Logan was doing well, now that he had stepped out of the shadows to speak the truth. As for the Reynolds, the criminal trial loomed ever closer. New bits of evidence trickled in, including more statements from previous foster children who came forward once they heard about the case in the news. The revelations painted a shocking pattern of intimidation, physical abuse, and emotional cruelty. Martin and Rebecca attempted to defend themselves, but their once polished reputation had been permanently tarnished. Public sentiment shifted largely in Charlie's favor, especially after local reporters wrote features on the hardships of the foster care system, using Charlie's ordeal as a rallying point for reform. Charlie's life, however, was not defined solely by the upcoming trial anymore. He had a stable home, a teacher-turned-foster father who listened to him, and a few genuine friends at school. His posture straightened, and he began speaking more in class. Mr. Simmons noticed that, even if Charlie still struggled with trust, he was blossoming into a thoughtful, creative young person. He took pride in Charlie's academic progress, especially in art. Several teachers commented on how Charlie's confidence had grown since he first arrived, no longer cowering at the back of the classroom. Olivia was thrilled to see these changes, often remarking how Charlie seemed lighter. She introduced him to more friends, and they occasionally hung out after school, watching movies or playing board games. Charlie still had moments of panic, like when he heard someone shout down the hallway in a manner that reminded him of Martin's bellow. He would freeze up, chest tight, until someone calmed him down. But these episodes gradually lessened. About a month after Charlie moved in with Mr. Simmons, a date was set for the trial. Charlie braced himself, knowing he might have to testify again, though the district attorney intended to rely mostly on recorded statements to spare him further trauma. The legal team had built a robust case. They had physical evidence, multiple testimonies from Charlie, Logan, and other foster children, and supportive experts. Martin and Rebecca, in desperation, tried to negotiate a plea deal. If they pleaded guilty to lesser charges, they might avoid a lengthy prison sentence, but they would be stripped of their ability to foster or adopt in the future. The district attorney was inclined to accept, wanting to ensure they were kept away from children forever. When Charlie got wind of a potential plea, he didn't know how to feel. Part of him wanted to see them stand trial and be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. Another part just wanted it over, so he could move on. Mr. Simmons explained that in many cases, a plea deal was a practical outcome that ensured they'd face consequences and not slip away through some legal loophole. Ultimately, the district attorney accepted the plea. Martin and Rebecca admitted guilt to child endangerment and abuse. They would receive a reduced sentence but still face probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent ban from fostering. After the formalities, Charlie felt a strange mixture of relief and anger. He had wanted them to realize the depth of his suffering. Yet he also recognized that his main goal had always been to escape their clutches. Now that was guaranteed. Officially, they could never care for him again, or any other vulnerable child. The victory felt bittersweet, but it was a victory nonetheless. When the news reached Logan, he sent a text to Mr. Simmons, who passed it on to Charlie. "They can't do it to anyone else. That's what matters. Be strong, bro." In the following weeks, Charlie navigated a new kind of emotional terrain. There was a space in his mind once occupied by dread of Martin and Rebecca that now opened up for calmer reflections. He found himself thinking about the future, maybe going to art school or finding a career that would let him help others. He told Mr. Simmons, one cool spring morning, that he wanted to be there for kids the way so many people had been there for him. Mr. Simmons beamed. "You'll do amazing things, Charlie," he said, hand on the boy's shoulder. At school, the final hearing about the permanent guardianship was all anyone on staff could talk about. Mr. Simmons was poised to become Charlie's official long-term guardian, a process that required final approval from a family court. The day of the hearing, Mrs. Anderson took a personal day just to attend in support, and Olivia asked if she could be excused from class to see it as well. Though that wasn't possible, she waited anxiously by her phone for updates. The family court hearing was far less tense than the criminal proceedings. The judge reviewed Mr. Simmons's records, including interviews from Dr. Stein vouching for the positive impact he had on Charlie. The social worker assigned to their case spoke highly of the home environment, describing Charlie's improved emotional state. Charlie himself took a moment to speak, voice quavering but eyes determined, explaining that he felt safe and wanted in Mr. Simmons's care. When the judge announced that guardianship was granted, Charlie's hands shook with relief, and Mr. Simmons had to blink back tears. They walked out of the courthouse, newly bound not just by teacher-student ties but by a family bond that was far more genuine than what Charlie had experienced under the Reynolds. "This is it, kid," Mr. Simmons said softly. "You're stuck with me now." Charlie laughed through the tears. "I'm okay with that," he replied. A few days later, a small celebration was held at Mr. Simmons's home. Mrs. Anderson arrived with a homemade cake, Olivia brought a stack of drawings she and Charlie had created together, and even Dr. Roberts stopped by briefly to congratulate them. Charlie sat on the couch, overwhelmed by the warmth in the room. It was a stark contrast to the lonely, fearful nights he'd spent at the Reynolds house. As the evening wound down, Charlie felt a sense of wholeness he had never experienced. That night, after everyone left, Charlie sat quietly at the kitchen table with Mr. Simmons, looking at the photographs taped to the fridge. There were snapshots of art club events, pictures of Charlie smiling shyly with Olivia, and even a goofy selfie Mr. Simmons had taken of them after finishing yard work one weekend. "Thank you," Charlie said, voice hushed. Mr. Simmons placed an arm around him. "For what?" he asked. "For everything," Charlie murmured. "For believing me, for not giving up, for giving me a home." Mr. Simmons squeezed his shoulder gently, not trusting his voice to speak at that moment. Time passed, and Charlie's life fell into a gentle rhythm of normalcy. He continued therapy, addressing the lingering shadows of abuse, and found that each day the nightmares were fewer and further between. He channeled his emotions into his artwork, creating pieces that Ms. Walton, the nurse, hung in the school corridors to inspire other students. He formed genuine friendships in the art club, especially with Marcus, who showed him new techniques with digital illustration. Olivia remained a loyal friend, and from time to time, they'd laugh about how far they had come since those early, tense days when Charlie first arrived. One quiet Saturday, Charlie found himself in the living room, flipping through old sketches. He paused at the darkest ones, images of belts, looming shadows, tears. He felt a pang of sadness, not only for himself but for anyone else who had to endure something similar. Then he turned the page to a newer piece, a bright, hopeful painting of two figures side by side under a warm sun. He recognized them as himself and Mr. Simmons, even though the faces were left abstract. The contrast between the old and the new artwork struck him. He whispered under his breath, "I'm safe now." He thought of Logan, wondering how his older friend was faring. They kept sporadic contact. Last Charlie heard, Logan was finishing high school and planned to head to a community college. They spoke about meeting up over the summer, maybe even working on a collaborative art project. The knowledge that Logan survived, too, and was forging his own path gave Charlie comfort. It also fueled his determination to keep fighting for a life defined by joy and creativity, not fear. As summer loomed, Mr. Simmons and Charlie planned a small trip. It was nothing too extravagant, just a weekend getaway to a scenic lake where they could fish, roast marshmallows, and talk about whatever crossed their minds. Charlie was ecstatic. He had rarely traveled anywhere, and the idea of a peaceful retreat without the specter of abuse was liberating. Before they departed, Mrs. Anderson gave Charlie a new sketchbook as a present, with sturdy binding and thick pages. She grinned. "Fill this with happy memories," she said. "And the ones that aren't happy? We'll face them together." The lake trip turned out to be a milestone in Charlie's healing. The days passed lazily under the sun, and the nights were spent by a crackling fire. Mr. Simmons told silly stories about when he was younger, about mentors who helped him become the teacher he was now. Charlie listened with rapt attention, occasionally opening up about his own dreams, becoming an artist, maybe, or a counselor for kids who had been in the foster system. They fished side by side, caught only a few tiny fish, but neither seemed to mind. Each moment felt precious in its normality, a stark contrast to the trauma that once shaped Charlie's existence. They returned home to the swirl of daily life, but Charlie carried a newfound sense of peace in his heart. The final steps of the criminal process played out in the background. Martin and Rebecca, having taken the plea deal, faced their sentencing. They were ordered to probation, mandatory psychological evaluation, and had to pay fines related to child endangerment. The outcome frustrated many who believed they deserved a harsher punishment. Still, with their reputations destroyed and the inability to foster again, they were effectively stopped from harming more children. Charlie learned of this sentencing through Mr. Carter, who assured him that they would never be allowed near him again. For Charlie, that knowledge was enough. He would never forget the horrors he endured, but he could now move forward without the constant fear of being sent back. He threw himself into his artwork and his new life with Mr. Simmons, forging a path that embraced healing rather than resentment. He continued to attend therapy, working through residual trust issues and flares of anxiety. But with each passing week, those moments of sheer panic were replaced by cautious optimism. In the meantime, Sycamore Middle School recognized Charlie's improvements. Teachers invited him to showcase his artwork during a school-wide event. Some of his pieces were dark, acknowledging his past, but others were filled with warmth and vibrancy. They represented his journey from a place of isolation and terror to one of hope and connection. When asked to speak briefly at the exhibit, Charlie stood at the microphone, voice trembling. He thanked the faculty and his friends for their unwavering support. He concluded, "No one should have to face the dark alone," and earned a standing ovation that left him teary-eyed but proud. A few months later, on a crisp fall morning, Mr. Simmons came across a box of old photographs, presumably from his own foster days. He spread them out on the dining table, calling Charlie over. They flipped through images of a younger Mr. Simmons with various foster families, some decent, some less so, until he eventually found the stable home that let him grow into the teacher he became. Charlie studied those photos, noticing similarities to his own fearful eyes and older pictures. "I wish we could show these to every kid in a rough spot," Charlie whispered. "To show them that it can get better." Mr. Simmons smiled. "Maybe that's exactly what we'll do one day. Make a difference beyond our own walls." Time marched on, bringing small celebrations and daily routine. The nightmares that once haunted Charlie diminished to rare occasions. He began to sleep more soundly, assured by the quiet presence of Mr. Simmons just down the hall. They developed jokes, traditions, a weekly movie night, a Sunday morning pancake ritual. The bond between them solidified, resembling father and son more than teacher and student. Even the simplest of moments, such as tackling homework together or discussing weekend plans, took on a sense of joy that Charlie once thought was reserved for other, luckier kids. Throughout the year, Charlie's file with CPS gradually closed as he entered the stable environment Mr. Simmons provided. The school year ended, and summer arrived once more, bright with promise. Charlie signed up for an art program at the local community center, where he met other young artists, and even sold a small painting. He gave half the money to Mr. Simmons for groceries, grinning in triumph as he said, "I want to help out." Mr. Simmons laughed, and accepted graciously. Occasionally, Charlie would reflect on the path that led him here, the moment he had run, terrified, to Mr. Simmons, begging for help, the endless swirl of fear and uncertainty, and finally the relief of being heard, believed, and saved. He felt gratitude toward every person who stood up for him, from Mrs. Anderson to the nurse Ms. Walton, and even Dr. Roberts. He also felt gratitude toward Logan, who had risked his own well-being to testify and prevent Martin and Rebecca from victimizing more children. It was during one of these reflective moods that Charlie decided to do something special. He began crafting a large painting, a gift from Mr. Simmons. Over the course of weeks, he worked on it in secret, using broad, confident brushstrokes. It depicted a figure in a glow of light, offering a hand to a smaller figure emerging from darkness. The background was full of color, swirling with warm, inviting hues, yellows, oranges, soft blues, symbolizing hope. At the bottom, he added the words, "Thank you for seeing me." On the day Charlie presented the painting, Mr. Simmons was moved beyond words. He wrapped Charlie in a warm embrace, tears brimming in his eyes. It was a moment that encapsulated their entire journey, from fear and secrecy to trust and open emotion. Placing the painting on the wall in the living room, Mr. Simmons said quietly, "I'll treasure this forever." Life continued, as life does. A year passed since Charlie first stepped into Sycamore Middle School, looking like a frightened rabbit. By the time he started the next grade, people barely recognized the old Charlie who never made eye contact or spoke above a whisper. He was still soft-spoken, still gentle, but he carried himself with a newfound confidence. He had friends, he had a safe home, and he had a future that no longer seemed overshadowed by dread. Eventually, Charlie confided in Mr. Simmons that he sometimes wondered about the day he would turn 18, finish high school, and officially step out of any remaining oversight from the foster care system. "Will you still want me around?" he asked, eyes glancing down at his feet. Mr. Simmons ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "As far as I'm concerned, you're family now, Charlie. You can stay as long as you want." Charlie's heart squeezed with gratitude. He realized that not every foster journey ended in adoption or guardianship that truly lasted. But maybe, just maybe, he had found a place to belong for good. As that future glimmered on the horizon, Charlie still looked back occasionally, remembering Logan's name, the closet, the nights of silent tears. Sometimes guilt crept in, as though he were at fault for not speaking up sooner or for surviving when others might not have. Dr. Stein encouraged him to forgive himself, to understand that a child in an abusive situation did the best he could under the circumstances. She reminded him that by stepping forward, he helped to ensure the Reynolds couldn't hurt anyone else. Slowly, Charlie internalized this, though the guilt never entirely disappeared. It instead became part of his empathy, a reason he wanted to help others. One crisp winter evening, while rummaging through an old box, Charlie found a photograph of Logan that had been taken with a Polaroid camera. On the back was a scribbled date from 2 years ago. Charlie decided to frame it, placing it on a small shelf in his room, next to drawings of comedic cartoon creatures. It was a nod to the boy who walked the same path before him, whose courage helped seal the fate of Martin and Rebecca. Later that night, Charlie sat on his bed, gazing at the photograph and the painting supplies scattered around his desk. He whispered quietly to himself, "We're okay now. All of us are moving forward." Time wore on, and with each season, Charlie grew in height and spirit. The once wounded boy who arrived at school covered in bruises was now recognized for his artistic talent and gentle nature. Whenever a new student arrived, especially if they seemed isolated or fearful, he reached out, offering advice or a friendly smile. Mr. Simmons watched these moments with quiet pride, knowing that Charlie's compassion was a direct result of what he had been through. Pain, when overcome, could transform into empathy for others. Eventually, the memory of the Reynolds found a sort of closure. The final requirements of their plea deal ended, and they retreated from public life. People in the town didn't forget what they had done, and their circle of friends dissolved. The house that once housed such cruelty was sold to another family, and it underwent renovations. Charlie drove past it one day with Mr. Simmons, feeling a chill in his bones, but also a sense of triumph. He would never step inside again. The closet in the basement no longer dictated his fate. Shortly after, Charlie got a letter from Logan. He read it alone in his room, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. Logan wrote that he was finishing his first semester at community college, studying social work. He said he wanted to make sure no kids slipped through the cracks like they both nearly did. The letter ended with, "Though life will never be the same, we move forward with newfound hope and resilience, determined to live in a way that would make it worth everything we've been through." Charlie closed the letter, thinking about how far they had come. For a moment, he felt an ache in his heart for all the trauma behind them, but also a lift, knowing that Logan was forging ahead, determined not to let his past define him. Charlie took that letter and tucked it into his new sketchbook. He resolved to keep creating art, to keep shining light on the darkness. He wasn't naive. He knew that nightmares could still lurk, but he was more prepared than ever to face them. He had Mr. Simmons at his side, a stable routine, and a circle of caring friends. The weight of Martin and Rebecca's cruelty no longer pressed on his shoulders. In its place, he carried a sense of gratitude, a knowledge that love and support could change everything. That night, as he settled into bed under the star-patterned comforter Mr. Simmons had picked out for him months ago, he reflected on the words from Logan's letter. They resonated deeply. "Though life will never be the same, we move forward with newfound hope and resilience, determined to live in a way that would make Logan proud." He whispered these words into the darkness, feeling them echo in his mind. It was a vow, to honor the journey, to help others, and to embrace the future without fear. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.